Hi, my name is Bhagwan Chaudhary. I'm a professor of finance at the Indian School of Business, ISB. Today, I'm speaking to Professor Pedro Santa Clara. Pedro and I were colleagues at UCLA many years ago, and he decided to go back to Portugal, and I came to India. But today, we have a chance to talk to each other about the crisis today. We want to understand in this situation, what do we do to protect both life and liberty? And a few days ago, Pedro wrote an article which I thought was very insightful. R0 less than 1. Pedro, tell us what you meant by that.
Well, hi, Bhagwan. It's so good to see you again. And it's a pleasure to be chatting with you. Well, the idea here is there's something very curious about the dynamics of epidemics. You know, how a disease spreads out over a population, and it turns out that how far that goes is governed by a single number that we call R, which is the average number of contacts that each sick person has and spreads the disease to. And the interesting thing is that as long as R is less than 1, that is, if on average each person infects less than one other person, then the epidemic actually dies out and disappears eventually.
Let me understand. I think it's an important point. What you're saying is it's not the number of people you're connected to, but it's the number of people you end up infecting. If it's more than 1, then of course it's going to expand. It's going to get bigger and bigger. Let's say it's 2. So 1 person infects 2, then 2 people will infect 4, and very soon it gets out of hand. On the contrary, what you're saying is if that number could be brought down to less than 1, then we have this geometric series that soon dies out. So one parameter sort of governs this all. But let's talk a little bit about what is going to determine that parameter.
Well, several things. Some are related to the characteristics of the virus itself, whether it's a lung disease or whether it's a skin disease, whether it survives well in the outside of your body or not, and how long it lasts. The virus, in order to be transmitted from one person to the other, has to get out of your body and be in a very adverse environment for a while. And for instance, they don't do very well with UV rays and stuff like that. So, but the other aspects that are very important, of course, are social interactions and personal hygiene and how the environment is. So if we hug and handshake a lot, and if we don't wear face masks and stuff, it's of course going to be much easier for the virus to be transmitted from one person to the next. Now, I guess the inside of that article, if you want to call it that, is that you don't have to drive this number R to 0 to get rid of the infection. It's enough that it's below 1. And
so a few things suggested that would help there is reduce the number of people you see often. So that's one variable. Wear protective gear like masks and other things. Don't shake hands, the social distancing. These are all measures that will bring that number R down from a high number, which may be the case for COVID-19, to below 1.
If you don't worry too much about getting the perfect measures to get completely rid of contagion, then you can do a very good job with imperfect measures. And I think that the most important insight here is that if you do a number of imperfect things at the same time, together they may actually do a good job. So to give you a simple example, we don't need to wear surgical masks, which have, I don't know, 1 micron openings or whatever, which are
masks might be enough for normal people. Doctors may need to wear surgical masks,
or a
but
scarf around your mouth or whatever,
in
anything
India,
that
a lot of women wear these saris and these scarves. Even those would go a long way.
Exactly. And I think this is important. I mean, you don't need to shoot for perfection, as long as you bring together a few measures, that like, and testing also doesn't have to be perfect.
Perfect. Okay.
As long as it's useful.
Yeah.
Perhaps we don't have the latest virus testing kit,
Yeah.
but we can easily measure temperatures of people.
Yeah.
And of course that's very imperfect, but it helps.
Yeah.
And I think the big point is, if you do a number of things that help you get closer to the goal of bringing R below 1, then eventually you'll get rid of the epidemic.
So this is very important for a country like India, where resources can be very, very important. So you're saying we don't need to order millions of surgical masks, just cloth would be enough, just temperature measure might be enough, but we have to do several of these at the same time to reduce the probability of this getting out of hand.
Exactly.
Okay.
And just make, if you do a number of things that make life difficult for the virus to go from one person to the next,
without making life impossible for those of us who are trying to.
Without having everybody starve to death, then I think you'll do a good job.
What is your prediction of how the world is going to look like in a year from now, you think? How big of an economic crisis do you think this is going to be?
Well, I'm actually quite optimistic. I mean, of course, we are still in a very difficult situation. I think, and the latest evidence shows that this epidemic has actually spread much more than we initially thought. Which is of course bad in the sense, that a lot of people caught the virus, but it's good in the sense that it shows that it's not as deadly as we initially thought it would be. And there's still one big question mark, which is how much immunity do you get from getting the virus? Whether that immunity lasts 6 months or 2 years. But if we're lucky and you get immune after getting the virus, and it's already quite spread out, then you would expect that after the containment measures get lifted, even if you do get a second wave of the epidemic, it's not going to be nearly as strong as the first one. And we'll see what happens, whether it eventually, it becomes endemic, a little bit like the flu, that comes in waves every year. It's this is a strange disease. It's a disease that doesn't seem to affect 80% of the people who catch it. And that makes it very tricky, because a lot of people seem to be healthy and still spread the disease.
Spread it, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then it's very, very complicated from a medical point of view for a very small percentage of the people. And in the end, the latest evidence we've seen is basically 1 or 2 in 1,000 people actually die from it. We're still, these serological tests have just come online, and so we're seeing the first tests in different countries, but it seems that it's not as deadly. It's 1/10 as deadly as we initially thought it was going to be, which is fantastic.
Right. Yeah.
but it's very, very contagious, and we need to be careful not to overwhelm health systems. But if it turns out like these, this is another bug that we'll be living with and co-evolving with until the point when we get a vaccine, which is, I think, is the final hope to really get rid of it, as we've done with other diseases in the past. But if it turns out like this, I think, we should slowly and surely be able to resume economic activity and have a speedy recovery. I think there's one last aspect that I think is very important, which is, at the same time that we had this COVID epidemic, we had an epidemic of fear,
Yeah.
like I've never seen before. It just swept the globe. I don't know if it's because of social media or what it is, or whatever. But people panicked, governments panicked, institutions were not really able to keep a cool head, and it's, I think, to me, interesting to see how we overcome that. How we're able to restore people's confidence,
Yes.
to be able to go to a restaurant, go on a plane, go about their lives.
Okay, Pedro, that was very insightful. Let me just summarize a couple of things you have said. The first thing you said was the important thing here is to decrease the rate of infection to less than 1. We don't need to go all the way to 0, because that is very expensive. That's very costly in terms of human misery. So as long as it is less than 1, that is good enough. And the second important point you made was that imperfect measures are okay as long as you do several of those. And this is particularly important for countries like India, where we may not be able to afford surgical masks, but a simple mask may be enough. Simple testing like temperature might be enough, but do a bunch of those. And the third thing, I think, was a note of optimism that the disease turned out to be not as deadly as we initially thought. And you're optimistic as long as we can contain the second virus, which is the fear. So on that note, Pedro, thank you very much, and hope to speak to you soon again. Bye.
Thank you, Bhagwan. Hope to hug you in the flesh.
Yes.
Take